right, welcome everyone. My name is Michael Konsowitz, Associate Director here at the Institute for Public Knowledge, UK. We're very happy to have a great panel today to discuss Ruth Braunstein, who's to my left. Her podcast, When the Wolves Came, Evangelicals Resisting Extremism. Something that's, of course, all too relevant these days and has been for decades. Ruth Braunstein is a sociologist at Johns Hopkins University's SNF Agora Institute, and was previously at University of Connecticut. She also leads the Meanings of Democracy Lab, which explores the moral and cultural foundations of American democracy. Her book, which you can actually purchase after the event, just outside, is entitled My Tax Dollars, the Morality of Taxpaying in America. It delves into how paying taxes became a moral battleground in public life. She's also the author of Prophets and Patriots, Faith and Democracy Across the Political Divide, and co-editor of Religion and Progressive Activism, News Stories about Faith and Politics. Here to participate in today's discussion, we're very lucky to have Delia Baldassarri and Bart Bonikowski. I'm going to introduce Delia first. Delia is the Julius Silver, Rosalind S. Silver, and Enid Silver Winslow Professor in the Department of Sociology right here at NYU. She holds courtesy appointments in the Wolf Family Department of Politics and the Management and Organizations Department of the Stern School of Business. Baldassarri's research interests are in the fields of economic sociology, political sociology, social networks, and analytical sociology. Her current research projects include study of emergence of cooperation in complex societies, focusing on the empirical case of ethnically heterogeneous communities, and a book project, Partisan Misfits, that investigates the demographic and social network basis of partisanship in American public opinion. Bart Bonikowski is Associate Professor of Sociology and Politics at NYU. Using relational survey methods, computational text analysis, and experimental research, his work applies insights from cultural sociology to the study of politics in the United States and Europe, with a particular focus on nationalism, populism, and radical right parties. I will add that both Delia and Bart are working group leaders of the polarization working group here at UK. If you're interested in learning more about the working group, you can talk to me or to I don't know about them. So please welcome both Bart, Delia, and Ruth.
It's very fun to be back in this room. When I was in grad school, I sat in a cubicle right around the other side of this wall for several years and came to tons of events in this room. And so it's just very cool to be standing up here. And it's also cool to be standing here talking about a podcast and not a traditional book. And this is a podcast that started as a podcast. It didn't start as a book and then get turned into a podcast. We created it as a podcast, and I say we because my production partners with the Master of Americans, 3 of the team are here tonight. So you can ask them all sorts of questions. And so I didn't really want to turn it into a traditional PowerPoint talk because that feels like something you do for a book and not a podcast. So instead I'm going to play you some of the podcasts. Not too much because that would be weird.
I'm Ruth Braunstein, a sociologist who studies religion and politics. When Donald Trump emerged on the political scene in 2016, he supercharged a movement I'd been tracking for years. A movement of religious extremists who believe that Christians, and only Christians, should run the country. I recently met an evangelical pastor from Phoenix, a guy named Caleb Campbell, who told me how people in his congregation started to change around that time.
People were meeting me in the lobby, putting their finger on my sternum saying, "Don't bring that liberal agenda into the house of God." And I'm like, what are you talking about?
Within a decade, this extreme Christian nationalist ideology had taken root in evangelical churches across the country. Now, the man they believe was anointed by God is President of the United States for the 2nd time. And if pastors refuse to toe the MAGA line, there are consequences.
I know so many of the stories where they end up losing their job, losing their churches.
But here's the part of the story you haven't heard. Some evangelical leaders are resisting.
I committed myself to taking a stand against American Christian nationalism in my community.
I said, if we're joining Team Trump, I can't be part of this anymore.
They were going to try to paint my theology as
not biblical enough, specifically because of my stances around race and racial justice. And I'm like, you know what, we need to leave loud.
And they're building a movement to fight back.
We needed some sort of organization that could speak to people as fellow conservatives, as fellow evangelicals, who could go into these spaces that are becoming radicalized.
This is the story of the evangelicals resisting extremism. Listen to When the Wolves Came, wherever you get your podcasts, coming March 4th. I'm Ruth Braunstein.
So truly getting to say wherever you get your podcasts was the fulfillment of a dream. And so you can see there's several episodes, you can download it and listen. We also were just nominated for what's it called, Signal Award. You can vote for us there. But we came out with this podcast in March of this year. And over the past several months, there have been a couple of moments where the sort of network or movement of evangelicals resisting extremism have become really visible. And the past few weeks was one of those. So when Charlie Kirk was killed earlier this month, the right-wing Christian world that he was a leader in has really asserted itself with fervor. And his funeral memorial service was a particularly high-profile example that brought together, leaders from across the evangelical world and really defined him as a martyr and a leader in that space. And it has led to a lot of commentary that, this is now the face of the evangelical world. But if you are kind of plugged into the right places, you can also hear from a lot of Christians, including conservative evangelicals, who are deeply uncomfortable with how they're seeing their faith presented on the public stage, and particularly how it's being used to justify attacks on democracy in the name of a spiritual battle. One of the most thorough and I think quite sorrowful reflections that I've heard came out today in the Atlantic from Pete Wiener, who has been a long time kind of never-Trumper, conservative evangelical, previous high-level staff person in several Republican administrations. And he reflected on the stark contrast during Kirk's memorial service between two moments. The first was when Kirk's widow, Erica Kirk, spoke and said that she forgave the shooter. And she forgave him because that's what Jesus would do, and that's what she believed her husband, Charlie Kirk, would do. And then right after that, the president, Donald Trump, came up and he said that he disagrees with her. He does not forgive his enemies, he hates his enemies. And in fact, will now be doing kind of everything within his power to ensure that his enemies kind of pay for what they've done. And so Pete, in his piece in the Atlantic, reflects on this, and he asks a question. He says, it's no longer an interesting question as to why Trump is an almost perfect inversion of the moral teachings of Jesus. What is an interesting question is why those who claim that the greatest desire of their life is to follow Jesus revere such a man and seem willing to follow him instead to the ends of the earth. And he goes through a quite thorough and long review of what he sees led to this moment within the evangelical world, and he concludes this: that politics, especially culture war politics, provides many fundamentalists and evangelicals with a sense of community and a common enemy. It gives purpose and meaning to their life, turning them into protagonists in a great drama pitting good against evil. They are vivified by it, and they reassure one another time and again that the dark passions are actually expressions of righteousness. And so what he's voicing there is so similar to what we heard a number of other evangelicals across the country voicing in their analysis of what they think happened inside of their community from around 2015, when Donald Trump rose to political prominence before the 2016 election. And in the documentary, which you just heard a piece of, we try to introduce you to this growing network of evangelical leaders who have spent years raising these concerns, and in particular, raising this concern that leaders in the MAGA movement, which included Kirk, have weaponized their faith to promote conspiracy theories, sow distrust in democratic institutions, and demonize their political opponents. And they've raised alarms particularly about the dangers of imagining that God has taken a side in a political battle between Republicans and Democrats, or even more broadly, between the left and the right. Because, as Wiener notes in this article, once people imagine that they are part of a spiritual battle between good and evil, any means of defeating evil can be justified. And once people imagine that the rights and freedoms associated with American democracy only apply to those on God's side, meaning them, then they can justify the stripping away of those rights and freedoms from their opponents. Again, in the name of doing God's will of spiritual battle. Many of the dissenting voices within the evangelical world were punished for their warnings. So during the first couple of years of the Trump administration, we heard report after report of evangelical pastors who either didn't say anything, stayed quiet while their sort of constituents were becoming increasingly radicalized, or who did speak up and were fired. And for many of these pastors, they run small churches for the most part, and they don't have a lot of translatable skills. So like being a pastor of a small church in a rural community is kind of their job. Like there's not a lot of other options. And so it created a real chilling effect on leaders in the evangelical world, that it was easier to kind of keep their heads down and let the wave pass them, or so they thought. And those who did actually stand up were sort of punished for that and pushed out. And only a small number of them kind of managed to continue speaking out. And from what we sort of learned along the way is that we know now that these were the canaries in the coal mine of a much broader effort to squash dissent in the broader political culture. But the podcast goes beyond simply kind of pointing to their insider critiques of their community as additional support for outsiders' critiques of evangelicalism. It attempts to learn from them, and particularly to learn from the leaders who have decided to stay within the evangelical world and sort of take a community that in their view has been radicalized and divided by outside forces, and work to repair what has been broken because they actually care about preserving what they see as the good of their communities. And learning from that was really revelatory. What we learned is that there's no single playbook for repairing a broken, and radicalized community, but that pastors are working, often way below the radar of the national media, to intervene at multiple different levels. On one hand, the main pastor that we profile, this guy named Caleb Campbell, who runs a medium-sized church called Desert Springs Bible Church in Phoenix, Arizona. And this is a picture of him just right before Sunday morning service one weekend. He's actually just published a book last year that is all about trying to be a missionary to Christian nationalists in his community. And what he argues is that people have been radicalized, but that doesn't mean that they can't sort of be brought back into what he views as a proper kind of understanding of what Christianity requires. And he does this through what he essentially calls intensive hospitality. Basically sitting with people, continuing to invite them to the table, continuing to invite them to worship with you. And he's basing this and his faith that this process will work on his own experience. And so I don't want to sort of spoil it, but one of the things that we learned about Caleb Campbell is that before he became a pastor, he was actually a neo-Nazi skinhead. And he was pulled into that world as a teenager who was disaffected from the church and generally from the world. And it provided sort of a social and sort of scaffolding for his life, right? A group of friends and meaning and purpose, and he felt cool to be part of something. And it took him many, many years to realize that that was not a world that had a future for him, and then to kind of unlearn much of what he learned there. But because of that experience, he knows that people can be pulled out of worlds that are relatively extreme and radical, and he knows how that worked for him, and how it worked for him was he attributes a lot of his de-radicalization to essentially a couple in his church that kept inviting him over for dinner over and over and over again, week after week, and sat with him while he said incredibly hateful and ugly things, and asked him what he calls humbly subversive questions, and sat and read the Bible with him until he started listening. And he was able to kind of gradually let go of some of those beliefs. And so he believes, right, it's like one of those commercials that like, I'm not just a salesman, I'm a customer, right? He knows that this works because it worked on him. And so, you know, he's working to encourage other pastors to engage in this. And when we talk to anti-extremism experts, we learned that what he's promoting is actually a fairly textbook form of de-radicalizing. And it's a kind of work that is incredibly time and labor intensive, and it's very difficult for most people to sit through and maintain the patience and space for it. But so he's doing this kind of individual de-radicalization work, you know, through the lens of Christian hospitality and mission kinds of work. And so, right, that's one level that people in this field are working on. At another level, they're thinking at the sort of meso level, in our sort of sociological terms, about like the kinds of spaces we spend time in and how those have lent themselves to radicalization. And so thinking, you know, from their perspective about church, what is it about our churches in this country that have led people to sort of be drawn into this hyper-politicized, you know, tribal understanding of what it means to be a Christian and an American? And so one thing that, again, Caleb at his church is doing is promoting the idea that churches should never be captive to a political party, right? This idea that as churches, our first priority and allegiance is always to Jesus, God, whatever our theology should be, and that political party should not even be near the top of that list. We talked to one of his members of his congregation, and he joked that Caleb is this sort of inscrutable political figure to people in the congregation, that he kind of likes to mess with people, and sometimes he'll wear one red sock and one blue sock in order to sort of make it clear that like he's not going to show you what team he's on, like what political jersey he's going to wear, right? And that there's no sort of like litmus test for people in the community, that nobody has to try and impress him by being kind of on his political side. And he refers to his ideal model of a church as a misfit church, which he draws on scripture to sort of describe as a church that's meant to sort of reach out and cater to the misfits of community, meaning people at the margins of community, but also a church where people within the community don't fit together, right? Where it's meant to be a place where a diversity of views, opinions, and ideas can coexist, and where people are meant to become comfortable dwelling in difference. And right from the perspective of him, and we also talked to his board member, it's become a real focus of their church that they want people to have more practice being in spaces with people who are different from them and disagreeing from them. And that one of the things that you get from church, much like we get from lots of other kinds of social settings that we spend time in, is practice, interacting with people in certain kinds of ways. And so they're thinking really hard, again, not just in his church, but among this sort of broader network of pastors around the country who are talking about these things, about how to change how our churches work in order to encourage sort of making people more comfortable, giving people exercise, dealing with difference, so that we don't fall into a trap where our churches are spaces where people are tested based on one aspect of their identity or belief system. And then finally, they are thinking broadly about the sort of broader social, political, and information environments that people are being exposed to. And, you know, many of the pastors that I've talked to over the course of this project are pretty well read on how social media algorithms work and how conspiracy theories circulate online and enter into communities, and are thinking about sort of the broader divisions in their communities and how church leaders need to be working with educators and police officers and, you know, other kind of decision makers in order to manage disagreement and difference in more healthy ways in their communities. And so, right, they're not just thinking about inside the church or inside individuals, but really trying to think big about this. This is a really big project. And so, right, they are not necessarily, you know, thinking this is something that they're going to solve by the next election cycle. A number of them specifically said that they view this as a generational challenge, not only for their church, but for the country as a whole. And I think that these are are important lessons to learn, not just because I find this community interesting as a research subject area, but I think the lessons that they are learning inside of this church about what's happening in evangelicalism are lessons that apply to the country as a whole, which is another community that is been radicalized, deeply divided, and is really broken in a number of ways, right? And so some of the same things that we might learn in this small space, right, could help us to think more broadly about the country as a whole. And so, you know, I think that I try to make the case in the podcast and in other kinds of places where I've written about it that even if you're not an evangelical Christian, right, we should care deeply about what is happening inside the evangelical world. And not just as a finger-pointing evangelicals are the problem way, but because what's happening inside of evangelicalism, this divide that has opened up between what sort of we see as more kind of MAGA church evangelicals and evangelicals who are resisting this, is part of what I see as a profound restructuring of American politics as a whole. And so in that restructuring, Americans are really sitting at a fork in the road right now. And if we go down one path, it takes us further down the path that, you know, the country has kind of been on-ish toward the pluralistic democracy that, you know, we've long sort of strived to become. And that's a society where people of all faiths and no faith, all races, ethnicities, shapes and sizes have a seat at the table and a say in the kind of society we build together. The other path would return us to an era of entrenched social hierarchy and to a supposedly sanctified social order where white, conservative, Christian men have unquestioned power over everyone else. In this version of society, the institutions that are designed to distribute power and resources according to fair or meritocratic processes like elections, educational systems, workplaces, even markets, are considered legitimate and might be held up as sort of important and democratic, but only if they sustain and legitimize the social hierarchy that God supposedly requires. When they challenge that hierarchy, when, for example, favored candidates don't win or people from more marginalized social groups take on positions of power, right? This is viewed as evidence that those systems are illegitimate and need to be dismantled. And so, you know, one of the challenges of understanding this sort of more hierarchical social order is recognizing that there is support for quote-unquote democracy within it, but it's contingent. And it's contingent on that democracy sustaining the hierarchical social order. And so, when we look at what this sort of shift means, right, it's important to recognize that for decades, American politics has been structured around what we usually think of as a right-left political divide between conservatism and liberalism. But I think this is no longer what divides us. We're now divided by which of these paths we choose to take, toward pluralistic democracy or toward hierarchical theocracy. And in this new landscape, the conservative evangelicals who are resisting extremism, like Caleb Campbell and others that we talked to, have taken the side of pluralistic democracy, which has left them separated from many of their longtime allies and peers. And so I think the question for those, and I put me in this category, who are also on the side of pluralistic democracy, and including perhaps people who are more liberal or secular in their political leanings, is how should we approach these conservative Christians whose conservative Christian values has often, in this right-left political divide, cast them as our opponents? Will we view them with suspicion and distrust, or will we work alongside them where we can in common defense of democracy? And the podcast is meant to tell the story of these evangelical pastors and leaders and the people in the pews who are trying to defend their churches and their country from extremist forces. When the MAGA movement crashed into the evangelical world like a tidal wave, lots of their peers rode the wave. But they rode against it. The work they're doing now is difficult, it's lonely, and it's often risky. And it will only have an impact if enough other people join them. And that includes people from within evangelicalism and beyond. So, one of the reasons that we created the podcast is we wanted people to hear their stories, to listen, to actually get to know them. For people who are themselves evangelical, I hope that it will encourage them to think about something differently or discover that there are more people like them out there. You know, a lot of people in this world who sort of find themselves uncomfortable with the direction that their churches have gone in will often describe themselves as feeling religiously or politically homeless, right? And so one of the things that sort of this network of evangelicals is doing is by, you know, creating podcasts and writing Substacks and writing blogs and putting content out into the world, is making themselves visible. They often use this imagery of sending up a signal flare to say, we're here, we're out there, there's more people like you out there, and we don't have to agree on everything, but let's have a conversation and make ourselves visible. And for people who are listening who are not evangelicals, hopefully the podcast will help you to see some of these evangelical leaders as people that you could maybe work with on some issues, even if you disagree with them on others. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to make this as a podcast as opposed to a more traditional kind of academic product is that the podcast medium itself has a level of kind of like intimacy to it that I think is, you know, goes far beyond what I would be able to portray in a book. You know, describing the words of somebody is not the same as letting that person speak for themselves and tell their own story. And I think that often when we are, you know, talking about these political divisions that rend our society, we are often talking about the other side in ways that might even be sympathetic or might be intended to increase understanding, right? Or at least that's a lot of my work is to do with studying the right and groups on the left and trying to sort of present them both in ways that they would recognize themselves. But at the end of the day, I'm the one telling those stories, or at least recounting them. And so the stories are always going to be sort of limited by my ability to portray them. And so the sort of podcast medium, like documentaries, but is a way that their voices can be more present, I think, in the stories, and they can, you know, I was just told today that Reading Rainbow is coming back, which is thrilling to me, but I love the thing that, like, you don't have to take my word for it. You can listen to them, right? You can listen to Caleb, you can listen to the other folks that we talk to in the podcast, and sort of decide for yourselves, like, is this person genuine? Is this person, like, how are they doing their work? And, right, how should we make sense of the struggle that they're enduring in order to be a voice of dissent inside of a, you know, a world that does not suffer dissent? And what can we learn from these dissenters about how to dissent more broadly in a society where dissent is becoming more difficult? So I'm happy to answer more questions about the podcast itself or why podcast or anything like that, but I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Ruth, for this beautiful presentation and for providing us access to this world through a video podcast that we're not particularly used to hear from an academic, but it really like captures perfectly the need of like doing this type of work, to study this type of communities, to actually understand what's behind general trends in terms of public opinion polarization, in terms of like division in the country, and to do it in a way that reaches beyond the academic world and goes beyond simply trying to understand what's happening, but also put our fingers on what people are trying to do in order to fix it. So this is amazing work. Since I'm an academic and I work from a very little corner, I am in providing a few feedback. I will start from what actually this work means to me and from my little world of people studying public opinion. And I would say this is the work that is most needed. And it's most needed because essentially most of the research that oftentimes people doing American politics do, and most of the things that you see out there in the media are really sort of like speaking about public opinion as in a very reductionist way. Like they talk about people, individuals, and they reduce them to some traits, but they don't never they never give you the context. It's always like individuals and their preferences or their hate toward each other. And this is partly because it is based on surveys and the survey experiments, so it's really like the source of information for the scholar is individuals responding to questions, usually online in their isolated environments. But also because most people have adopted a way of thinking about public opinion in a very reductionist way in terms of psychologizing things. The main story is always an us and them that comes from identity theory in psychology. And I'm not saying that's totally wrong, but what I'm saying is that like through Ruth's work, you actually get to see how, for instance, a group of people have decided to take sides in politics in their like church environment. And you immediately discover that from the texture that she provides, that these like taking sides have little to do with their own personal preferences or in like quintessential identification with a party or another, but it has a lot to do with their need of like having a social dimension of identification. And we see it with Caleb, where he goes like, oh well, I became a skinhead because they actually accepted me. And then I started to hang out with people in churches because actually they needed the drummer. Okay. So he just needed to fit in because like, which is need number one for humans, and is definitely need number one for humans in certain conditions. And this is actually what brings people to then embrace ideologies. And you immediately get this sense that like you end up one way or another, just as a consequence of the people you hang out with. And then you build on it, and you sort of listen to stories and you like develop a rhetoric, and hate and love are real, but in some ways they are conveyed, are through these physical, personal experiences that unfold at the local level. So this is very, very evident from your account. And then like next to it there is the organizational dimension, the parishes, their need of having congregants to like, follow them. You mentioned the priests themselves, like even if they felt like opposing this new trend of embracing republicanism and certain brand of it, they felt like themselves, several of them like couldn't rebrand themselves, and therefore they just went along. And then there is the economic side of the story, which you just touched briefly upon in the podcast, but I think it's the big piece that we need to bring into the picture. Like when mentioning and providing examples of how Turning Point started to be active in the sphere of the evangelical churches, you point out that they actually brought events and resources to these churches. And these are churches that are oftentimes economically struggling, as well as the environment around them. So like that element of like a top-down process where like an organization that is very well supported by a bunch of people we don't even fully know are just like injecting themselves in these realities is an important observation, which is completely lost when you just like look at statistics and how people respond to surveys. So my first point is really like thank you for bringing these textures, because it's really what they need to look at. And continuing on this line, I want to actually sort of like remind everybody that the level of political polarization that we are experiencing nowadays is not something that emerged from a bottom up, but is a very much top-down phenomenon, which started with like parties polarization in Congress, and it has a lot of like origins that have little to do with people's preferences. They have to do with money politics, with interest groups, with fragmentation of the media. Whether it was planned or not, we are here not because people really like woke up one morning red and blue, but because this has very much been imposed onto them. And I love the work that Ruth is doing, because actually it actually does one thing that most people working in social sciences forget to do, which is actually to work at the tensions that ordinary citizens have to endure in order to survive in a very polarized environment. Like the fights, the losing friends, as well as like having to decide whether to take one side or another, and we don't have the voices of the people who left the churches, but for sure there will be plenty of them as well. This understanding of the tensions of how people struggle with this sort of country becoming red and blue, and media is always producing like an image of the country as a red and blue one. It's extremely important, and we don't do enough of it, and the way you did it is really beautiful. And then the other thing that actually I love in this work is that it brings to our attention one aspect that is very real and it scares me a lot, which is the extent to which partisanship might be permeating like personal and social life. I'm Italian, I didn't grow up under fascism because I'm not that old, but I've heard a lot about it. And the one thing that I really think about when I think about the distinction between authoritarian regimes and democracies is that in democracies, you don't have to think about politics all the time, and politics doesn't permeate your social and personal life. While in authoritarian regimes, that's actually often the case, like the way you conduct yourself in public spaces, the opportunities in terms of jobs or housing, and also like some personal choices are affected by the regime. And this is a big difference. And when I see the US sort of like thinking in terms of partisanships in areas, in places where it doesn't belong, I start like reacting very negatively. And I mean about, and definitely the division in churches is one of this. I am also even more worried about the permeation of the entrance of politics in domains like PTA conversations. Like schools are falling apart, and parents are fighting over like books that kids could not read. Like that doesn't make any sense. But it is happening, and there is also some legal evidence about people like deciding to choose who to associate it with on the basis of partisanship. I think this is actually not happening unless you really push people to do that, unless you push people to actually choose their partisanship on a dating app. They don't think about partisanship as the first or second or third criteria in order to choose their potential friends or partners. But of course, if we as a society start to adopt that as a criteria in order to choose like who to accept in our context or not, like the situation gets really like negative. So I actually really appreciate your work in terms of like figuring out how partisanship has become a dominant aspect in the life of these churches. This said, I also have some questions about your work and how this is actually something that we should take, for instance, as a new phenomenon, or whether like this is something just like a regular continuation of what American churches have been for centuries. Like Martin Luther King famously said, 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. And if anything, now it's slightly less segregated than it was when he said it, but it's like the history of American churches is a history where social divisions have been present. Exclusion is as much as presence as inclusion is, and if you think about it, like some of them were also directly political, like KKK events often happened after church gatherings, just to give you an example. So my question is whether how much this is a new phenomenon, and how much this is maybe even more provocative, how much, especially when we think about the US, we have actually found virtue in churches, whereas churches might have been for a long time a source of like division. I think about like Robert Putnam, for instance, like his romanticized view of some forms of like communitarian gatherings, and were as divisive as they are inclusive. So in some ways, I have this really dominant question, which is like I see and I see virtue in what Caleb is doing and what other people are doing, But in general, can we really think of churches as a place where we really can have a pluralistic society? Or if that is actually always going to be a limitation in some sense. Connected to this, I would like to know more about the broader context where this is happening. I think of these as social deserts. These areas where these churches are active are also social deserts in some ways, not all of them. Like it's a very different environment. They are active in very different environments, but a bunch of them might be in places where the industrialization has hit, where fentanyl crisis is big, where all other sources of getting together and forming community have disappeared. So like the old like people cling to guns and religion story that Obama brought to the table, I wonder to what extent like these turning into political agents might also be explained by contextual factors that you're not bringing in, but I believe that might be at play. And finally, I have a couple of questions about what do you think the nun's role in society is? For those that are not fully familiar with the relationship of religion and politics, essentially, Jeff Manza is here, like Mike Out is in our department here at NYU, is pretty visible throughout history, especially in the last 50 years, but essentially partisan sorting has occurred with respect to religious denominations. And this has occurred, like, it was almost complete by the 80s. What has really like changed in the most recent decades is that like the nuns, the people who declare themselves not to be affiliated with the church, have increased in numbers, and they have also started to split mostly quite evenly across the two parties. So in some ways, quite paradoxically, I would actually see them as a force of unification for the country more than the churches themselves.
Like for the podcast when you mentioned the nuns, you had to spell it out.
Yeah.
N-O-N.
Yes, thank you.
And also write about Catholic nuns sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. It can be
Sometimes,
confusing.
yeah.
It's just been a pleasure, Ruth, to re-engage with your work. I've been a fan of your scholarship for a long time, but to listen to a podcast in preparation for an event like this is just such a treat, even though the topic is nothing to smile at. But listening to 6 episodes of a podcast to prep, awesome. And also, partly because it's so engaging, so beautifully done. The production really solid as well. This is the kind of podcast you would hear, some of the best on NPR elsewhere. And so it was just a real treat, and made me want to kind of advocate that most sociologists should be doing some sort of podcast, but then thought, no, actually, maybe they shouldn't, because they're not all as gifted as Ruth, and very few are, actually, so probably most would not work out quite as well. But I just think it's a terrific medium. It's much more accessible, and I think, you described wanting to feature the voices, but also presumably to reach audiences that otherwise you wouldn't have, so I think this is just wonderful. What's remarkable, there are many remarkable things about the podcast, but one of them is how it weaves these complex threads of kind of what's been happening in the last 40 years, and this culmination we're seeing now, and it weaves these threads with an accessible and compelling narrative, and these are really complicated threads, right? So the podcast can be sort of listened to and interpreted in a variety of ways. On one hand, it's about Caleb, it's about these pastors, it's about the churches, but it's also really a narrative about how our politics got to here now. Right? So we hear about long-term trends like the fusion of evangelicalism with Republican politics that took a long, long time. The persistence and revival in many ways of white supremacist extremism. Demographic trends in religiosity that Delia just mentioned. The unfolding of affective polarization in the U.S. where everything gets increasingly painted onto the binary partisan structure. The transformation of what's always been in popular American culture, that is conspiracy theories, right? The paranoid style in American politics has always been here, but its most recent incarnations have been deeply woven into this story of radical right politics. The emergence of a thick, deeply intertwined network of extremist organizations on the right, including Turning Point USA and Turning Point Faith. So these are the kind of long-term trends that are all described in the podcast in a really elegant way. But also events, although what an event is debatable. But 9/11 features importantly as a precursor. The Obama presidency, the Tea Party, of course, COVID in particular, you really pinpoint an important moment. January 6th, and presumably if you were to add an addendum to the podcast, Charlie Kirk's death would have been a prominent moment as well. And all of these trends and events are relevant to the rise of MAGA, but how these puzzle pieces fit together is really difficult to figure out. And I actually think the podcast's narrative captures them in a really compelling way. And I've been in this line of work for a long time, and even for me, I was thinking, wow, I'm really getting some stuff here that was a little opaque to me before. So congrats on that. There are many features that really stand out here in terms of the material, but I want to just mention three. One is the centrality of gender and misogyny in American right-wing politics, alongside, of course, race, religion, attitudes, and so forth. And relatedly to that, so that's something you showcase, but related to that, the fact that Trump's appeal among evangelicals is not purely instrumental. That is absolutely revelatory for me. I mean, I knew it, but the way you capture it is remarkable. That maybe at the beginning some were voting for him while holding their noses, but over a longer term, they actually see him as the perfect representative. And a lot of that has to do with gender, right, and misogyny. And with what his supporters see as speaking truth to power, breaking norms, saying how it is, and getting their country back to where it should be. And then the third thing that, again, timely, is the role of Charlie Kirk and his organization in boosting Trump's popularity and helping train the spiritual foot soldiers of MAGA. And what a moment, right, where he's now being lionized as a hero when a guy was a bigot, a demagogue, and frankly a traitor, given his role on January 6th. And it's terrifying to say these things, right? Because it's not part of the party line. Where have we come to? It's insane. So all of that in a matter of 6 episodes, where you're also doing the whole story talking about the pastors and the factions within the churches, just remarkable. They managed to cover all that territory so well in that relatively short period of time. The comments and questions I have are kind of unfair. But it's your fault, because you bring up these big questions about where did this come from, and how do we think about the rise of radical right politics more broadly. So I'm going to ask less about Caleb and more about the big picture, and I think it's, to the extent that it's fair, is because you're also an expert in this topic more broadly, beyond just the podcast. So the one thing I always think about when I'm in settings where people talk about white Christian nationalism, we've been in some of those things together before, is this just an American inflection on a broader cross-national story, where in some settings religion is up front and center, and others it's not. And so if there is this variation, what are the prime causes? So certainly Eastern Europe, Poland, Catholic fundamentalism right in the middle of the story, very similar to the US, including the media ecosystem being deeply informed by Catholic nationalism, et cetera. In Italy, there are echoes of this, right? If we go beyond Christianity, in India, Hindu nationalism, very similar mechanisms. But then there are other places in Western Northern Europe where religion is maybe part of this, but not in nearly in the same way. There are other kind of resentments and other ideologies that are fueling the rise of radical nationalist populism with very similar consequences. And so kind of thinking about how much primacy, causal primacy, to give to white Christian nationalism in general versus in the US case. I think in the US case it's absolutely compelling that this is at the core of the movement. But what about the cases where that's not happening? So there's something else in the water that, across contemporary democracies that's leading down similar paths. Then I guess many of my thoughts about this kind of boil down to something that was suggested in this first question, and that is, how much of the story of white Christian nationalism is a story that is sort of the core explanation for Trumpism versus one of the many currents that led us toward Trumpism, right? In some ways, the Trumpist coalition is a broad and uneasy one. It's white Christian nationalists of the sort you described, but it's also, tech elites who are, for most part, secular, but have other ideologies, long-termism, techno-accelerationism, etc. You get some free market ideologues. You know, it's a complicated coalition. And how much of it is sort of this instrumental, you know, bedfellows who are kind of working on an authoritarian project together for very different reasons. And so if that is the case, then also what are the consequences? How fragile potentially is this coalition? When do these fissures come out? You know, we can sort of be on the same train while it's heading in the same direction, but eventually once we kind of accomplish something, maybe there's a schism and these divisions come up. So in some ways that's a question, I think Jeff, you put this earlier when we were talking about this, like what happens after Trump? There will be an after Trump eventually. I'll say nothing else, right? But like, right now it's a cult of personality, as you well have described, among other things. But once that subsides, presumably it goes on, depending on how institutionalized it is. But some of these fissures in the coalition may then emerge. And relatedly to that, you know, a lot of the policy initiatives that the Trump administration has put in place are deeply unpopular. If we just listen to kind of the story of white Christian nationalism within the evangelical movement, it seems like, oh, he's delivering everything they want, everyone's happy, this is great, and that's probably true for the core, the hardcore base, but most of the stuff he's doing in general is unpopular. And he's getting away with it because he's captured institutions, right? If he hadn't captured institutions, presumably he'd be out of office before long. And so there's also this question of, again, is this a coalition? Is this much more multivocal than a single kind of white nationalist core? A couple of other things. Back to the event. So you mentioned the role of COVID. Now I want to hear a little more about that, because the way you describe it as, I think the quote is that it's the match that lit the fire, right? It's lockdowns were seen as persecution of Christians. It really catalyzed all the anti-government fury that was brewing for a long, long time. BLM happened at the same time, so obviously got reflected racially. But of course, Trump lost after COVID, right? And presumably what his return to power has some other kind of causal factors. So just thinking about in what ways some of it kind of brings up questions of how these events matter, and in some ways they're underdetermined and hard to pin down causally. Same with 9/11, same with all the other events that you mentioned, and I've mentioned in my own work too. It's like, in some ways, sometimes they lay the groundwork or they catalyze kind of causal factors that come back much later in a totally different form, but are not necessarily automatically immediately enacted. So just something to think about. Three more quick things. One, denominational variation, something that would be great to talk about, both within Christianity, or within evangelical Christianity, but also within Christianity more broadly, where the Catholics line up here, et cetera. And Delia again mentioned some of the demographic trends and the way that polarization works differently across denominations. But thinking about who are the allies and maybe competitors within Christianity more broadly, beyond just the evangelical churches, would be interesting to hear about. And then maybe circling back to the question of, is this the story, or is this a story? And I'm going to put a fun point on it. Assuming that we are past the point of no return, which I'm not saying we are, but if we assume for a second that we are, and there will not be fair elections, and there will be a one-party state, are we going to turn into Gilead or Oceania, right? And the question is, again, comes back to where is Christian nationalist, white Christian nationalist fundamentalism in this story, right? Is it central? Is this, you mentioned theocracy? Or is it just a convenient way for others to gain power, in which case authoritarianism, kind of old school 1984 style, just as likely? Or some unusual mix. We could talk about solutions. I mean, everybody wants solutions for most of we talk about this, and in some ways you're brave to actually show some solutions. Most of us are at a loss when asked, what do we do? Write it out. But I think you beautifully put it, like everybody should just do one thing. And it happens to be Caleb's thing that he's doing this missionary work within the evangelical space. And you do many things, but you say in this podcast, like this podcast is your thing, right? And if we just all do one thing, it adds up. But a lot of the things, not your podcast, but a lot of the things happen at the micro scale. Or even at the mesoscale, but targeting individuals. That's something Jeff and I talked about earlier. The problem is, all of that's, it's a problem of scale and velocity, right? So this work is painstaking. It's micro level. It takes a generation. The destruction of democracy is happening at a structural level in months. I mean, yes, it's been a long short-term, prelude to this, but it's really happening at once. And so we kind of need solutions quickly at a structural level, which is really hard to do. So maybe there are some lessons in this world that you're studying, but also from your other work, like what else can be done? In some ways, what we need is institutions to hold up, but they're crumbling. We need movements to rise up, but people are scared. We need the Democrats to say something meaningful, but they don't know how. So it's hard to find hope these days, and in some ways, you are providing us with hope at one level, but how do we build up from this? Yeah. Sorry. So if you just answer all that.
What do you want me to do?
A few more podcasts.
We only have so much time, but if you could take 5 minutes to respond, and then we'll move over to Q&A.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so, thank you so much. It really is a very difficult process to embark on a project as a scholar accustomed to writing papers with lots of citations, to try and tell this story, and I'm smiling looking at my writing partners because it was a struggle to figure out how much do I feel comfortable flattening and simplifying some of the really complex scholarship on this stuff in order to kind of give people enough context to understand this story. And so I am really grateful that you guys don't think I got it totally wrong. And just to be able to have this deeper conversation about kind of below the sort of surface of that big story. Because that's one of the hard things about doing the more public-facing work, is that you have to sometimes do that sort of simplification, hopefully without being distorting, right? But getting people just a taste of what this complicated story is. So with that in mind, I will quickly, I think, answer one or two of the questions that I hope will actually maybe help the conversation. And one of them has to do with what I think is new behind all of this. And I actually think you answered your own question by bringing up the nuns. Because one of the things that is new, so politics has always been present in religious institutions in the United States, right? And you can go back and point to examples of this on the far left, the far right, everywhere in between. And from my perspective, there's nothing really wrong with people using and drawing on their faith values in order to understand politics. Because politics is just a big conversation about how we want to structure our lives together. Of course, we're going to draw on our values. What has shifted is this political sorting of religiosity. And in part, when in many cases mid-century, when there became a kind of right-left divide within many religious traditions, people began sorting into sort of more conservative or liberal wing of their traditions. And so that was sort of step one. But step two, as you mentioned, was that as the kind of more conservative side of many denominations organized as the religious right and became much more vocal in national politics, people who were more moderate or liberal in their political leanings, according to your colleague Mike Hout and others, basically said, if that's what religion is, and I don't hold those right leanings, I guess I'm not religious. And so it disproportionately liberal and moderate people left religion at higher rates than conservative people, and that sort of has now grown to be almost a third of the population that identifies as nothing in particular. And as you mentioned, they're not all liberal, but during that whole process, religious conservatives are incredibly successful at pointing at this rising non-religious population and saying that the leftist society and leftist secular society is the kind of enemy. And then the nuns also were kind of pointing at religious conservatives and saying religious people are conservative. And basically, the sort of public idea that Americans came to have of religion is that it was coded as conservative. And that's not entirely true. I spent a lot of time with liberal and left-leaning religious people, but even although those people are there, they tend to be less well-organized, less active at the national level, and quieter in their style of politics, while the religious right is very visible nationally and much louder about their faith and their style of politics. And so all of that conspires to give us this impression that God has taken a side, and God is on the side of the right. And I think that that opens up space for a very different kind of politics today. The other piece of this that I will just say is kind of what is it about the kind of Christian tenor of right-wing politics here that is distinctive? And I think it's a great question. I don't actually totally know the answer. I mean, I think we're all kind of figuring out like what is going on at the global level that has driven this, rise in support for authoritarian regimes and attacks on democracy. And I think that what is clear to me, based on people like you and other people's research, is that there was already this thing here called Christian nationalism. We didn't always call it that, but essentially this like fusion in many Americans' minds between what it means to be a real American and being kind of Christian, culturally conservative, and usually white, or kind of like culturally comfortable with white mainstream culture. And that was just available as like a really powerful cultural carrier for this authoritarian kind of style of government, in part because it allows you to make the argument that God wants the country to look like X, Y, or Z. And if you can't get there through democratic channels, then other means have to be sort of brought into the picture, right? And in this case, authoritarian control by somebody who, even if they are not themselves a pinnacle of Christian values, will do everything they can to break things and turn things back into the Christian kind of nation we desire. And then finally, to your last question, because this is a very strange and fragile coalition, as you mentioned, and I think that like the public love fest breakup and maybe now love fest again between Donald Trump and Elon Musk is really like kind of a perfect encapsulation of this. But Christian nationalism, I think, serves less as the kind of deep core of the coalition than a really helpful cultural glue for it. And it operates as a way of sanctifying the vision and sanctifying the leader. Because, right, Elon Musk is even perfectly comfortable saying that God chose Donald Trump, that God saved Donald Trump from being shot. And, right, that really helps to legitimize the entire project. And then I do think that at a looser level, they share in common a distaste for democracy and a desire for a small cabal of elites to essentially have a lot of power and be in charge. And I think that the question is, will those elites be theocratic elites or technocratic elites? And at some point, that fight will happen, right? But only after the institutions of democracy have been decided. But, so yes, Gilead or democratic resurgence.
Questions? Yes.
So thank you so much. This is really fascinating for me. I mean, especially as you mentioned, the religiously homeless people. My family, I'm from Indiana. My family left our church for 22 years last week because of a lot of this kind of stuff that you're talking about. And so I think the point that really struck me was when you mentioned what's happening in different denominations, because like when I look at that picture, that is not like the church that I grew up in. Like it's very traditional, very like we call those like big box churches, like a lot of people, and I think that happens in more rural areas. But I think it's really interesting the movements that are happening in suburban areas in the United States and then in traditional types of churches that historically weren't, like you wouldn't see MAGA or Trump flags in the church. Nobody would say that. But it's the values that are instituted in like just the general ways people are talking about things, that it's very like inherent. You can tell, but they won't say it. And so, and I think in some other evangelical churches, it is very like they will just say like, oh, we support Trump. We like this is the way. And so I think that there's this other side of denominations that have historically been more traditional that don't say it out loud, but there's a lot of movements that are happening. Like movement in my church in Lutheranism is head coverings that are coming out recently. And it's the social identification that we talked about. You're not doing it to be in church because you're in front of God. That is a signal that you're under the authority of your husband. And it's not like, they don't be like, God doesn't care. You don't do that because God cares in church. You do that because you're signaling to other people that you're under the authority of your husband. And then I just heard like from somebody else that it's happening in Catholic churches too. And so these are in suburban areas where people like, I don't come from the middle of nowhere in Indiana. Like, I mean, we're pretty close to Indianapolis. People that have lived all over the world. It's a pretty diverse population too where I'm from. And these kinds of movements are happening. And so, and my mom actually, like, the reason that we mostly left was because of the misogyny and things like that that were happening. And so, that's what I was actually gonna ask about is how have you seen it in different denominations? Because the misogyny was, people were talking to my dad about things that they wanted my mom to change. Because they wouldn't talk to her. So that was weird. So we left like last week, and and I think the podcast was the perfect medium for this, because that's exactly how people are being reached right now. I mean, my whole family listens to like Joe Rogan, like, you know, like nobody's reading a lot of like books or academic papers, but everybody's listening to podcasts, and you drive so much out there. And so, like, I think that this is a really good medium to reach out to that kind of population as well.
Thank you. That's like, I mean, that's such a fascinating side of this, and I think that to your point about the denominational divides, they first, you know, during the kind of right-left divide that Robert Bucknell, as a sociologist of religion, wrote about sort of around the sort of mid-century, that denominations used to be the main way that Americans saw themselves. Like, I'm a Lutheran versus I'm a Methodist versus I'm a Baptist. And that really shifted when there were these broader battles about I'm a religious liberal versus a religious conservative. And today, those labels don't even matter as much, because a lot of it has to do with these other divisions, and gender is such a big kind of like subtle cue of what side of that divide you're on. And so if you look at probably the Christian Nationalist Coalition, you have evangelicals, you have Pentecostals, you have the kind of New Apostolic Reformation, which is largely kind of like rooted in Pentecostalism. You have, you know, sort of very conservative, what are called kind of integralist Catholics. And all of those people are together in this in coalition, but they're also consuming the same social media content and producing the same social media content. Mormons are sort of part of that as well. And one of the through lines of that content is promoting a highly traditionalist vision of gender, and so it's often referred to as sort of trad wife culture, and this idea that it's important to submit to your husband's authority. And so there's hard and soft sort of trad wife content. And like, as a woman of a certain age with children, I get fed a lot of the parenting versions of this. You kind of like can't cleanse your feet a bit, because I'm like, oh, that's really pretty playroom, you know, and then suddenly I'm down on the rabbit hole about like how to create an organized playroom. And that's a lot of that content is created by hyper-traditionalist women. The other side of it, though, does involve things like modest dress in this. And so it's fascinating to hear that that's manifesting in spaces sort of for the first time in your church. I think we should be looking into that really carefully.
Yeah, like it's getting to more mainstream, not just like the outside, oh, those are the crazy evangelical churches. Because my church would always be like, oh, those are the evangelicals, so we have the big box church and whatever, it's like a concert. But now it's like a lot of the same values are seeping into ours. And then also the power dynamic, that the pastor isn't actually in charge of the church, at least for a lot of the traditional ones, is that if our church disagrees with our pastor, they will get rid of him. Yeah. And then call a new pastor that agrees with them. So we got a new pastor about 5 years ago, and it's been different.
Yeah. Well, that's so yeah. Is it a Missouri church?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, what, sorry?
A Missouri synod.
Yeah, there's different synods, and that makes it different. It's like they would never, like they always point the finger at Elka and do it, but like, you don't like them.
Yeah. Well, I do think that that's one of the lessons that the pastors learn, is that like they say we get people for one hour on Sunday, and social media influencers get them for 35 hours. They're in their pocket all week, and in their ears and on their feeds, and that pastors felt that they actually lost their authority to speak out, and so that was a kind of another reason why they would just sort of stay quiet, not talk about politics at church, right? Or totally quiet. So yeah, that's like a big part of the story too.
Hi, so I'm not in the final episode yet, and I've been telling everyone like this is the most like amazing and horrifying like story I've been listening to over the last few weeks. So my question is to kind of go back. You've already mentioned it a little bit, but the idea of like there's so much content, there's so many ways you could frame this 6-episode arc here. What were kind of like, one or two maybe of like the big picture ideas that you wanted to get across in terms of telling this narrative, and is there a season 2 planned?
I looked at Louisa and Jeff, who were our disciplinarians on our outline, because, I think we wanted to tell one pastor's story as a way to tell this bigger story about the image that I always use is this tidal wave that hit the evangelical church. And so the evangelical church had been a conservative space, for sure, and a politicized space for decades. But then when it got pulled toward this sort of MAGA version of politics, that felt to many people antithetical to most of the values that were being promoted in the church. That was confusing, and also that came with a huge amount of conspiracism and distrust of institutions and leadership, and it changed the tenor and tone of the kind of communities within churches and made them much more combative. And so that's also part of the COVID story we ended up realizing, because COVID, I think we haven't all fully gone to societal therapy about.
I appreciate the trigger warning you had at the beginning
of
that
it's
episode.
it's stressful to even go back to that moment. We all just kind of put it behind us, but it really kind of fundamentally broke us as in we lost some of our muscle memory about how to interact with each other. And so that was a big part of it. So yeah, so we tried to stay close to the story, but then use that as a way to kind of talk about this bigger set of dynamics that are happening beyond this story. And so behind all of this, I talked to pastors all over the country who are experiencing similar kinds of things. But in one person's story, Caleb's story, we were able to see really fundamentally a lot of the moving pieces. So for those who haven't listened, basically he speaks out against this. He loses 80% of his church. Those people go down the road to an evangelical megachurch that is partnered with Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA, and really leaned into the MAGA movement and brings Trump to speak during COVID. And that's a decisive moment for these two churches and kind of a turning point in the fork in the road. Most pastors would have kind of broken or been fired and replaced, but he stays in leadership. And so it's about him kind of rebuilding from that low point and deciding to kind of speak out in this way. So we thought that was a helpful way to tell this big story about what's happening through one person's story. So that shaped a lot of our decisions. And I don't know if we're making this easy too. Does anybody have any money?
I don't. Thanks, that was a really fantastic panel, and I haven't listened to the podcast yet, but I'm looking forward to it. I was wondering, so one of the first things you led with when we talked about Caleb Campbell's strategies was de-radicalization and intensive hospitality work. And so I was kind of wondering, when we were brainstorming solutions, where the meso meets the structural. We find places like universities, for example. So I guess I'm kind of wondering two things. Number one, in your own practice as a professor, how do you see this playing out in your classrooms? I guess you just moved to teaching at a JHU, but how do you see this in Connecticut? And second, given the attacks on universities by the federal government, what do you think would be the way for universities to position themselves to do this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I loved this idea of misfit church. And that to me was a framing concept of the whole series, this idea that these dissenters are misfits within the evangelical world, and that creating spaces for political diversity is so difficult in our society as we become much more politically and socially sorted. And the stat that I always find fascinating when I teach sociology of religion, I get gasps from my students, is that when you used to ask parents who they would be worried about their children marrying, it used to be marrying someone of another religion or another race, and now it's somebody of the other political party. And so we've really become this, we've kind of really rejected the idea of living together across our differences in so many ways. And so the idea of what would it look like to cultivate misfit spaces more broadly than just churches in all kinds of places is, I think, fascinating. And so, can we do that in our classrooms is, I think, one of the sort of interesting questions. I know that I teach sociology, and sociologists do tend to draw an eclectic group of students from around the university, often students who have not or who maybe have a sense that sociology might be able to teach them something about their own experiences at the margins of society, right? And so, I often think of my classes as groups of people who understand marginalization in sort of specific ways, but also places, law students that just have to take it because it's an ed requirement, right? And they don't always agree on everything, and often when we're talking about topics like gender, race, and sexuality, and religion, it surfaces disagreements. And so I have been trying to think more about like what would it look like for the classroom to be a place where like we can sit with uncomfortable kinds of disagreements and comments, right? Where like the point of being in the class is moving over the course of the semester in your understanding of topics, not necessarily being there on day one. And so, you know, that's something that I'm continuing to think about that I think could be, you know, I think that the academy gets aligned unfairly as being a place where everybody is required to think one way all the time, but I think that for students interpersonally, there are often conflicts when students sort of are espousing more heterodox views. And so, right, how do we as professors cultivate these sort of spaces where we help students build up that muscle of tolerating and living with and sitting in disagreement.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, well, this was just like every other conversation with you, where you leave us with a terrifying tidbit of like technocrat versus theocrat. But you said something about like our two choices being a pluralist democracy or a hierarchical theocracy. And what is the hierarchy there? Is it the Christian dominionism overall, or is it like within the theocracy there will continue to be millions of layers of hierarchy as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually disagreement about that within this coalition. The one that has the most like clearly defined version of this is kind of Seven Mountains dominionism that would say that at its most kind of extreme form that only, you know, white meaning of European descent, Christian meaning fundamentalist Christian men should be in charge of everything. And that's from the family to the various sectors of society, with politics kind of as the highest mountain to mount. And, you know, I think that the people who held those views were considered radicals 10, 15, 20 years ago. And one of the most prominent of them is this guy, Pastor Doug Wilson, who, you know, goes so far as saying that women should not be allowed to vote because men have headship in their homes and therefore should be able to vote for them as a family. Certainly women should not hold positions of power or influence in any other sectors of society. He also famously tried to argue that slavery was a good institution. And so, right, this person was like persona non grata in mainstream gatherings a decade and a half ago, and then now is being welcomed into the very center of power. His network of churches, the Secretary of War, I believe is what he's called now, he has attends one of his churches. And so, you know, he's considered really central to this movement. And so his version of hierarchy is kind of the outer limit, right? But then there's a lot of softer versions of that. And some of these versions of hierarchy say that this is a country that was created for European Christians, and that it only works if it continues to be led by European Christians. But we believe that it should be a diverse country, and we welcome diversity under the condition that those people live under our authority and live according to our rules. And so this is a kind of more quote-unquote soft version of Christian nationalism that is being espoused by, you know, sitting senators, by Josh Hawley, who gave a big speech basically to that effect, by people like J.D. Vance, by pretty much anybody who makes this argument that immigration is a problem because some people belong over there in their countries and some people belong here in our country, right? That kind of idea that countries should be sorted according to sort of ethno-religious identity are espousing that kind of vision of hierarchy. And so, you know, I think there's certainly variation, but all of those are now part of a mainstream conversation.
So, question.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if white Christian patriarchy is consistent with certain denominations, and a lot of people see themselves as carrying out God's battle, then on what ground do resistors within those denominations stand? Like, how does Caleb present evangelical arguments to sort of like convince people, and is it not more of like a missionary project of outside forces coming within? Because aren't these like, is he not going against evangelical values or not?
It's a great question. So, you know, there's actually a really robust theological and historical debate happening within evangelicalism and sort of the adjacent traditions over the extent to which sort of that patriarchal vision is actually the historical sort of essence of their theology. And so within evangelicalism, for example, there's been a big movement over the past several decades to remove women from positions of leadership and then to build a theological scaffolding around the idea that men have authority over women in the household and in the church. This often is referred to as kind of complementarianism, that there's a theological basis for men and women having different roles and therefore different levels of authority. But there's a lot of historical and theological work being done that says, like, this was a modern invention, that this was not ever sort of part of the sort of historical church, that women served in leadership for centuries in the church, and that there's a lot of evidence for this. There's actually another really great podcast called All the Married Women that goes back and finds into the archives of, I think it's the Southern Baptists, and finds records of lots of women who served in pastoral roles historically. And so, you know, that's a debate, that's an internal debate that is happening about kind of how new is this version of like what the church has always been traditionally, and when was that created and promoted. The same goes for questions about race within the American Christian church. And so there was a number of people, including someone we talked to for the podcast, who is looking at the early Christian church, or is looking cross-nationally at sort of how Christianity formed in other places, and asking what role did kind of white supremacy and institutions of slavery and sort of the genocide of Native American peoples in the US, how did those things feed back into the formation of a distinctive American Christianity? And like, what parts of those are actually Christian, right? And what parts of those do we need to like unlearn or strip back? And so those are debates that are happening internally, and so he's participating in some of those debates, right?
I have a question about how effective you think the approach of radical hospitality and what he's trying to do with the blue socks and the red socks is, as opposed to imitating the tools of conservative evangelicals and their takeover, which is not about pluralism and all of that. And I see it from where I'm from, which is Israel, where a lot of these places of pluralism is basically like the right wing being right wing, and then the left wing has to pretend they're kind of center, and they don't really speak, and then the whole center also shifts to the right in this like kumbaya, everybody's welcome, but not really, because some people are committed to pluralism, so they try to really not be as dogmatic, and other people are coming with dogmatism and are ready to fight and to win. So I love the radical hospitality. It fits with my sensibilities, but do you think it's effective?
No, not right now. No, I mean, we talked to a woman named Catherine Stewart who has been following the sort of organizations and money behind the far-right movement for decades, and she basically was like, this is a vicious spiral, and it's a downward spiral, right, away from democracy toward sort of like more extremism, and that the ways that these groups are thinking about off-ramps are the off-ramps, like those are the off-ramps, but right now there's just exponentially more resources into being poured into that cycle of increasing kind of radicalization and extremism, and there's very little money being put into the off-ramps. And so, when you think about it that way, it's very discouraging. And so, for her, the main intervention that she calls for at the end of her most recent book is that people who care about this should be pouring money, and creating organizations and creating, a pipeline of leaders who are promoting these kind of off-ramps from, increasing polarization and extremism. And without that, the best intentions of the kind of ragtag group of well-intentioned people may not ever be. Yeah. So it's discouraging, but maybe also a to-do item, right? Like money.
I have a quick question. I noticed that neither Reagan nor George W. Bush really pop up in the podcast. I know you can only cover so much. Yeah. Reagan gets mentioned once, and 80% of it, about saying someone agrees 80% of the time. That might not my enemy. But I'm just wondering if any of your sources talking to them, revisited like recent-ish presidents and identified like signs of continuity. I mean, I'm not disputing that we're living through something different, but there are links. I wonder if that ever came up, whether it's in the 1980s or 2000s.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, to some degree, a lot of the, quote unquote, never Trumpers within the evangelical world and outside of them will often point to their service in previous Republican administrations, and particularly George W. Bush 1 or 2, as like, I have Republican credentials. Like, I am a conservative. I believe in this sort of version of the Christian right? And then being like, but I can't with Trump. And so that did come up repeatedly, particularly for some of the folks who are part of these kind of networks behind the scenes trying to bring pastors together, because that gives them that credibility of like, we're not actually liberals, right? Like, we are Republicans, we're conservatives, and we also don't like Trump. But, they really were not, they were very inclined to draw a sharp boundary between previous iterations of the kind of Christian right and what they're seeing today, in part because I think that they have an interest in marking that distinction. But, yeah, no, it's a good question.
I just have
Like
to
Louisa said, Louisa was part of all of the interviews.
I'm thinking of people that remember the idea of a compassionate conservative, like
Yes.
that.
Totally,
I
yes.
think that's the baseline for a lot of folks we talk to.
Yes.
The two things I kept on thinking about was, one, it was personal. The Catholic Church I grew up in became more like kind of consistently coherently conservative during George W. Bush years in the wake of 9/11. And then two, there's the MSG's camp documentary. So when George W. Bush is like being treated as this like godly figure.
Yeah.
And one would assume that that was the only place where that was happening. And maybe that died out. It was 2006, 2007, but it was happening for at least a few years.
Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, in that movie, a lot of what those kids at Jesus Camp are celebrating is the idea that Bush is going to anoint judges that will support anti-abortion politics. And so we did hear from a lot of people who were, anti-abortion, and that was a real motivating issue for them. And the issue of being anti-abortion got very seamlessly integrated into a broader set of concerns about the left hating and wanting to harm children. And so one of the sort of really eye-opening things for me and for us in our field visits to, particularly to the mega church that hosted Charlie Kirk's Freedom Night, was the widespread kind of acceptance of sort of a set of pieces of information that all fit together for them that was basically aligned with QAnon's central premise, which was that there's this conspiracy of powerful people on the left who are working to harm children, sexually traffic children, and that basically they would connect the dots between kind of sex trafficking of immigrants at the border, the introduction of what they view as inappropriate books in school libraries, and particularly books about non-traditional families and abortion. And that like all those things were being promoted from the stage as like interlocking, interconnected issues, and then people we talked to mentioned all of those things. No one mentioned the words QAnon, right? But just the way that like that, the sort of deeper story of the left wants to harm children had really permeated that space, and right, what better issue to motivate the sort of treating of the other side as demonic, right? Which was actually a term that was used, right? Because of course, like people want to harm children, that's like that's the line, and so that was really powerful, and I think the anti-abortion movement sort of a lot of people had experience in that, and that sort of fed into that narrative.
Given that, don't you think that the Epstein Files issue is a key cleavage point that we should be exploiting?
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems like it has more traction than almost anything else that the administration has faced, and you would think that of all things could be something that would kind of make people ask questions about the kind of plausibility of his entire movement's claims about this. But but it's very hard. I mean, when you're moving fast and breaking things, it's very hard to get anything to sort of stick in people's heads, and so I don't know, I think we'll see.
There's a lot of money on the other side. You mentioned Kathleen Stewart's book.
Yes.
She really does an amazing job of breaking it all down, and there's this Claremont Institute, which I was not very familiar with, but there's tremendous money that's been poured into this, and they're really just anti-democratic, and they're using the religious side. But
Yeah, I mean, so if you look, right, it reveals a much larger network of organizations, beyond religious organizations, that, you know, basically see this as a really, like, helpful cultural kind of wave that their message can work.
there are a lot of us, though. I really believe in just marching and speaking up.
One thing.
Well, Ruth,